So our first speaker is Dr. Agnes Loeffler. So Dr. Loeffler is a chair of pathology at Metro Health Medical Center in Cleveland, Ohio. She earned her medical degree and PhD at the University of Illinois in Urbana, then completed AP-only residency at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center. Her PhD is in the field of cultural anthropology. Very interesting. And she will be addressing the topic of her talk, Dr. Karl Landsteiner and the discovery of the ABO blood groups from the vantage point of an anthropologist. One of the reasons she dropped the CP part of her residency was because she couldn't wrap her mind around the complexities of blood typing, so she will deliberately skirt the topic of blood transfusions during this talk. And that was specifically mentioned from her to tell me to you guys. So we welcome you, Dr. Loeffler. So the podium is yours, and thank you very much again for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Sergio, for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to thank you especially for giving me the opportunity to present on a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, which is the turn of the century, Vienna. So here is the CME slide that you're going to be seeing throughout the meeting, and I have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. I also want to point out that I do not have any learning objectives for this talk. I want you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. So, Dr. Karl Landsteiner described the ABO blood groups in 1901, and 29 years later, he won the Nobel Prize for that discovery. Important biographical events are listed here on this timeline: his birth date in 1868, milestones of his 25-year career at the medical faculty at the University of Vienna, his emigration to the United States in the middle of his career to take on a research scientist position at the Rockefeller Institute, and finally his death in 1943, where he died in his laboratory with pipette in hand. Pretty much every biography mentions that little fact, just to point out what a through and through scientist he was. Along the course of his career, he published close to 350 publications and won numerous honors and awards, not just the Nobel Prize. This kind of a biographical timeline puts into words a curriculum vitae, but it doesn't shed any light on the character or the personality of Karl Landsteiner. And even less does it shed any light on the context of his life, which in this case was the phenomenal turn of the century in Vienna, which saw an explosion of creativity in the arts, in humanities, in technology, in the sciences, in the philosophy, and not least in medicine. So my purpose in this talk today is to take the life of Karl Landsteiner as a keyhole to take a peek into the Vienna of the turn of the century. So I'll start with the actual discovery of the ABO blood group system. A bit of a to-do is made in the history of transfusion medicine that Karl Landsteiner actually published on agglutination in normal human blood as a footnote. That was a footnote that appeared in another paper, which was published in 1900, called Towards Understanding the Anti-Enzymatic, Lytic, and Agglutinative Effects of Blood Serum and Lymph. This was a series of animal experiments that Dr. Landsteiner conducted to elucidate the chemical differences between agglutination, lysis, and anti-enzymatic activity. The famous footnote appears in the fourth section of the paper, and in it, he merely mentions that the serum of healthy individuals agglutinates not only the blood cells of other species, but also often that of other individuals. A couple of important things about this footnote. It is not supported by data. It does not mention the ABO blood groups, and neither the footnote nor the paper has anything whatsoever to do with blood transfusions. 1 year later, a young man by the name of Philipp Eisenberg published a paper in one of the leading medical scientific journals of the time. That was a weekly paper, and the title of this paper was On Isoagglutinins and Isolysines in the Serum of Humans. Dr. Eisenberg was what we would now call a resident in internal medicine, and he spent time in a laboratory. I'm not sure which one it was. I'm assuming it was the laboratory, a large laboratory of immunology in Vienna at that time. This is an absolute mess of a paper. It runs on over 7 newspaper columns in very flowery language and in almost a stream of conscience kind of presentation. The conclusions that I've listed here come in the first paragraph, and then he goes on over the rest of the paper to ramble on over prior literature. He hypothesizes at length, he suggests at length what other experiments need to be done to address one or another hypothesis. He suggests additional experiments, and finally, he criticizes one of the other researchers interested in agglutination at that time, who was a professor of gynecology at the university, for using, for his experiments, the blood of pregnant women who could not possibly be called normal. So in this study, he presents the conclusion number 2. In 10 healthy individuals, only 1 had isoagglutinins in the blood. He further goes on to say later in the paper that in that one patient that showed agglutination, that reaction was negligible. 4 issues later, so hardly any time at all, Dr. Landsteiner wrote or published the paper on the agglutination of normal human blood. He could not let that prior paper sit. He had to say something about it. So he summarizes the studies that claim that agglutination is exceptional in normal humans. And then he simply states, this result contradicts my own. And that is again accompanied with a footnote. And in that footnote, he says, although Eisenberg, so he's referring back to that paper I just presented, although Eisenberg, on the one hand, attacks my declarations, and on the other hand, confirms them, he does not with a single word mention my work in his text. In other words, he's saying that little squirt, he has no idea how to do science. I'm going to have to rub his nose in it. And he does. In 3 short columns of text, he then proceeds to clearly and concisely demonstrate how very wrong Eisenberg actually is. Altogether, Landsteiner tested the blood of 22 individuals. It is very amusing to me to think that the entire billion-dollar transfusion medicine industry rests on a study with an N of 22. In 4 crystal clear sentences, over 2 paragraphs, he then describes a curious regularity that emerges from this experiment. He actually doesn't show all of his data. He, even though there are only 22 individuals that he would have to show, he doesn't show it all. And he says he conducted the latter experiments just to corroborate the findings in the prior ones. And they demonstrate that my conclusions do not need correction. He then makes very short shrift of Eisenberg's hypothesis that agglutination happens as a reaction to substances that are released from decaying red blood cells. Other than the fact that this is a paper, that this experiment used an N of 22, one other thing that I find very charming about this paper is that Landsteiner mentions the men whose blood he tested, in other words, from whom he took samples by name. Dr. Landsteiner conducted this research when he was an assistant, what we would now call a resident, actually when he was a second-year resident in the Institute for Anatomic Pathology at the University of Vienna. There he is sitting in the first row. The institute director was Dr. Anton Weichselbaum. So, the names of these individuals. That is Dr. Stöck. Dr. Stöck was the son of a famous laryngologist, actually one of the founding fathers of laryngology at the University of Vienna. Dr. Stöck himself stayed in pathology. He became a full professor of pathology at the University of Vienna, and then the director of a laboratory associated with the General Hospital. The gentleman in the back here is Dr. Jakob Erdheim. Dr. Erdheim also was a resident in the Weichselbaum Institute. He also became a pathologist, a very renowned bone pathologist, and we still commemorate him in the eponymous Erdheim-Chester disease. I cannot definitively identify the other members, the other men who are listed here, but I can tell you that Dr. Sturli went on to describe the AB group. So Dr. Landsteiner's original group of 22 people was not large enough to include someone with an AB blood type. And it was Dr. Sturli who actually did the experiments to demonstrate that blood type. So from this photograph, we are reminded that Karl Landsteiner was actually an anatomic pathologist. And this is a list, a very short summary of the topics on which Landsteiner published during the course of his career. And the topics range from anatomic pathology. He earned his keep doing autopsy pathology and described many diseases from the basis of autopsy series. In infectious diseases, his name is especially related to poliomyelitis because he was the first to demonstrate that polio is a transmissible disease. The ABO blood groups were actually a serendipitous discovery, which didn't interest Dr. Landsteiner at all, again, until very late in his career. He did publish a paper on the forensic application of blood typing while he was in Vienna, but then he wasn't even interested in Dr. Sturli's discovery of the AB group. Oh, well, so what? I've moved on to other things. Moreover, Dr. Landsteiner would be appalled to have his name mentioned alone in relation to these discoveries and contributions. This slide lists the 44 co-authors of Dr. Landsteiner during his time in Vienna. Most of his publications were actually published with other individuals. This slide actually contains a lot of information, and I'm not going to go through all of it. That would be terribly boring. I do want to point out that the various colors are indicative of different specialty areas within the field of medicine. Most of the people with whom he published were trainees, not so much medical students, but definitely residents, what we would now call residents, in various areas throughout the medical faculties. So in psychiatry, OBGYN, and so forth. They came from all over the Habsburg Empire. They came from Bohemia, from Croatia, from Serbia, from southern Tyrol. They came from provinces that are now in Poland, in Romania, and even in the Ukraine. Vienna was a magnet for bright young men to come and either finish or complete their medical education. There is even one American listed here. Many of them returned to their country of origin and were founding members of the medical faculties in their home countries. But the men who are listed here in bold type were actually already professors at the medical faculty when Landsteiner published with them. Among them, I want to point out Julius Wagner von Jaurek, who was a psychiatrist and later won the Nobel Prize for his research in neurosyphilis. He gets a big gold star because he won the Nobel Prize. Another individual I want to point out here is Wolfgang Pauli, who was a chemist at the medical faculty in Vienna. He and Landsteiner published on electrophoresis of immune globulins. And he gets a little star because he was the father of a Nobel Prize winner. And daddies get to boast a little bit about their children's accomplishments. So he gets a little star. It was his son who won the Nobel Prize in physics after the Second World War. All right. So now I'm going to take even one step further back. We've surveyed Dr. Landsteiner in the Weichselbaum laboratory. We've seen the large list of people with whom he published while he was in Vienna. This is taking a step back. And what I've done here is create a spreadsheet in which every line represents the biography of a professor at the University of Vienna who held a leadership position at the university between the mid-1900s and the mid-19th century and the early 20th century. I've grouped them in terms of specialty. I hope you can barely read along the left the specialties. I know that you cannot read anything within the biographies, and that is intentional. I don't want to go through 107 biographies here. That would be deadly. So every row contains a biography, and every column running from left to right is a year. So Dr. Landsteiner's row is the one that's indicated with a little red arrow at the very left top in the field of anatomic pathology. And this little red arrow that's pointing down onto a column indicates the year 1910. The reason I chose to highlight the year 1910 is because that was the year that an influential report came out on the deplorable state of medical scientific medical education and research in the United States. So I'm putting that in there just for perspective. These were the years that Karl Landsteiner was in Vienna, from the time he started his medical degree to the time that he left Vienna in 1919. And as you run your eyes from top to bottom, you can see how many people, how many important scientific researchers and educators were at the Medical University of Vienna at the time. So Karl Landsteiner did amazing research, and he did research all across the field of pathology, and he won a Nobel Prize. But none of that made him exceptional at the university, at the medical faculty in Vienna. He was one of many. In fact, what I've listed here are only the men who held leadership positions at the Medical University of Vienna. People like Dr. Störk and Dr. Erdheim, whom I mentioned earlier, don't even show up on this list. So just to put into perspective, so who all is on here? The eminent surgeon Theodor Billroth is on here, the first surgeon to perform a gastrectomy. The Sigmund Freud is on here, the psychiatrist. A couple of others before we move away from here. Theodor Escherich was a pediatrician. He was interested in his research in what we now would call the gut microbiome in infants. And his name is associated with a microbe that is still ubiquitous and we still are contending with every day. He was also a very early proponent of breastfeeding, which was quite a remarkable thing at that time. This line here in the gray area represents the biography of Sigmund Exner. Sigmund Exner was a comparative neuroanatomist who had a special interest in studying the neurons of the cerebral cortex. In the 1870s, he mentored a female American medical school graduate. So I'm going to go back and state that again. 1870s, a woman medical school graduate from the United States who went to Austria to perform research and to complete her education in Vienna. She and Sigmund Exner conducted research on ovarian tumors in rabbits, and in their publication, they described the Karl-Exner bodies. And finally, one last person I want to call out is Karl Wenkebach, whose name is inextricably associated with the electrical conduction system of the heart. He was actually raised and trained in the Netherlands and spent his early career in Germany. The reputation of the medical faculty in Vienna at the time was so great that it could attract not only the best and brightest students, but also the best and brightest professors from throughout Europe to come and join the faculty. So the fact that so much excellent scientific work came out of the Medical University in Vienna at the time really should not be considered separately from all the other creative impulses that were flowing through Vienna at the time. You can go to a bookstore and pick up books on any of the topics that I've shown here in these blue bubbles: architecture, art, music, philosophy, anything. Everywhere you turned, there were bright ideas, there were new ideas coming out of Vienna. The problem with those kinds of books is that they tend to, or stories, is that they tend to focus on just one discipline and forget that all of these spheres were really tied together, both at the level of ideas, so a foundation in belief in scientific progress, a belief in rational thinking, a belief in taking principles to their logical extreme, and a belief in self-actualization and the merit of an education in developing, bringing out the best of anyone's potential. But these spheres were also connected by way of interpersonal relationships. And these ideas and the novel thoughts and approaches that were being developed at the time moved from one sphere to the other, and medicine was no different. Let me give you a couple of examples. So the gentleman who used the blood of pregnant women, the gynecologist who used the blood of pregnant women to conduct research on agglutination, was married to the prima donna at the court opera who earned the highest wages. So already, with that one relationship, you know that this professor wasn't just sitting in his laboratory. He was socializing with the musicians at the time, which included the likes of Gustav Mahler and Arnold Schoenberg and other creators of 12-tone music and modern music. At the far left is at the very bottom is a black and white etching of a man who was the consultant to the Minister of Education after the revolution in Austria of 1848. He pretty much single-handedly laid the foundation for scientific research and education at the university, including at the medical university. His son was Sigmund Exner, whom I showed you in the previous slide. Theodor Meinert was a psychiatrist. He was the mentor of Sigmund Freud. His wife led a salon at which the literary circles of all Europe, artists and poets, would congregate and discuss the newest literature. And Sigmund Freud himself had to pull at the apron strings of his aunt to mediate the sale of a work of art to seal his promotion at the medical school. So yes, corruption and politics also played a large role in Vienna at that time. And the last one that I want to show is down here at the very right, the founder of the person who brought modern journalism to Austria and who daily, for 28 years, daily wrote an editorial that was published in the leading newspapers of the time on the rights and responsibilities of individuals in a democracy, was none other than the father of Karl Landsteiner. So these connections were all pervasive. They're like a thick felt carpet that welded ideas and people together at the turn of the century in Vienna. So returning to Karl Landsteiner, when I suggested this topic for my talk today, I was very much hoping to be able to trace Landsteiner out of the laboratory. I wanted to trace his footsteps somehow, somewhere into the thicket of Viennese society. It was not possible. Karl Landsteiner was a very reserved man. He spoke when he was spoken to. He was very happy to help his colleagues do their research and critique their ideas. But he hated being in the limelight. He hated to have his photograph taken. He didn't even want to acknowledge that he had won the Nobel Prize when that was finally announced. He treasured his network of scientist colleagues and let his work stand for himself. But I did find one tiny little thread. It goes over his mother. His mother, Fanny Hess, had an older brother who in his first marriage had 4 children, the oldest of which was a little girl by the name of Sophie, who grew up to be a very beautiful young woman. After her mother's death, Sophie didn't get along with her stepmother, so she left home and went to live in a town outside of Vienna called Baden. Baden is a spa town, similar to Bath in England. And at that time, it was a town where the nobility, the well-heeled, the rich and famous, the nouveau riche, the old rich, anybody who wanted to be seen could be found in Baden. She took a job in a flower shop. And for a moment, I'd like you to entertain the stereotypical flower girl of the Victorian era. Not very well educated, a little bit naive, flirtatious, coquettish, and on the lookout for a good match. She found a good match. She became the mistress of none other than... So, by pointing this out, I don't mean to suggest anything nefarious. Alfred Nobel died when Karl Landsteiner was just 28 years old. He was, at the time, he had just finished his medical degree and was actually doing a tour of chemistry laboratories in Germany to learn techniques of chemical experimentation. There is no indication anywhere that the two families had anything to do with each other. Alfred Nobel bought his mistress a wonderful, apartment in Paris, and she seemed to spend most of her time there, though she also had a villa in the outskirts of Vienna. But there's no indication that there was any coming and going. I have no documentation that Alfred ever pinched little Karl's cheeks and said, "Aren't you a cute little boy?" There's nothing like that, okay? So don't take this the wrong way. I'm illustrating this just to say these networks were thick in Vienna at the time. And I think it's high time that we get away from doing the timeline kind of biographies that we are apt to do, even of the physicians at the University of Vienna, and really begin to explore how these networks developed and how the ideas that flowed through these networks influenced the discoveries and the innovations that were going on in Vienna at that time. So with that, one more slide. This is Dr. Landsteiner at the Nobel Prize ceremony with the other Nobel laureates. And for the past 6 months, I've been trying to understand what he's thinking at this ceremony. So I have a couple of captions, and you can tell me which one you like the best. He did not know why the blood groups were being pointed out. His work on the specificity of serological reactions was so much more important. His book on that topic actually went through 7 editions. So, but transfusions are transfusions, right? How do you weigh one against the other? All right, there you go. It's a very, very short bibliography. If you'd like to know more about turn of the century Vienna, I can recommend other books as well. I do want to call out the websites, though, at the bottom of this slide. They are a wealth of information about the medical faculty at the University of Vienna at the time. And finally, a thank you to some of the individuals who accompanied me on this journey, especially Dan Curtis, who has been very active with the History of Pathology Society and encouraged me to give a talk here. The bottom right, my mother, who is born and raised in Vienna and has spent every Sunday since October helping me make sense of some of the things that I was finding, some of the odd things about Viennese culture. And my son at the left is studying music in Vienna and is my stand-in for the obligatory picture with the plaque of Karl Landsteiner that's hanging in the arcade courtyard of the faculty. I missed the opportunity to take my own picture there, so he's my stand-in. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Loeffler.